I will call this meeting to order and welcome everyone to meeting 135 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. I think we all know the protocol around here. All the questions come through the chair, if you don't mind. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, September 18th, 2024, the committee shall commence and study on the protection of freedom of expression. So we're going to welcome our witnesses in a moment. But if you don't mind, we have 1 hour with the witnesses today till 5:30. But I would like to talk about yesterday because it was breaking news yesterday. Committee members, I will update further as we will have the second hour of this meeting with committee business dealing with what happened in the House of Commons yesterday. It's in regard to the House order that was passed yesterday instructing this committee to return to the 8th report that the chair of the committee tabled in the House. The committee was instructed to return to study the bonuses and staff cuts that were made to the CBC, and that the current CEO, Catherine Tate, and incoming CEO, which is Marie-Philippe Bouchard, as well as the minister and experts, will appear before the Heritage Committee. As you all know, we have the minister coming next Wednesday, so we'll talk about it in the second hour.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. There's only 1 hour scheduled for the meeting.
No, we actually have 2 hours scheduled for next Wednesday.
An hour. So I just want to be
this
clear.
one, yes.
This
and
week,
then,
so you're talking about Monday.
Yes, that's right, Mr. Noor Mohammed. I would like to set aside 10 or 15 minutes because of what happened in the House yesterday. We need to talk about what happened in the House, as now we have been summoned by the House to have Catherine Tate come, the new CEO of CBC, along with expert witnesses. So I know we're only scheduled here for an hour, but as the chair, I think we do need to get our names into
order.
Mr. Koto, I believe, yes?
Yes, we have to get consent from the committee to do this, right? It can't just be the prerogative of the chair. We need to have a discussion and vote on it, correct? To change the agenda?
Clerk? What's that?
The agenda.
Yeah, you know, thank you, Mr. Koto. This was, as you know, kind of historic yesterday, what happened in the House of Commons, but it's an administrative issue that I would like to bring up after our 1 hour meeting here today with the freedom of expression. And according to the
difference. Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair, I apologize.
No, go ahead. No, I was just.
There's a difference between what you want to bring up and what the agenda of the committee is. So unless we move a motion to adjust the agenda, I don't see this as a valid discussion point. We can always have this discussion at our next meeting.
Well, I'm bringing it up because we have till December the 17th. We have a rigorous agenda. We have 1 week off as constituency week coming up, and this has to be tabled with the current CBC president and the incoming one, plus the minister. All this has to be done by December 17th. And so I think the clerk would like to have some direction on, you know, when do we start this? And plus, you know, expert witnesses. We have 3 hours of expert witnesses that every party would like to submit. Who is an expert witness?
If I have the floor, I have the floor, can I move that we deal with this on the 17th then?
Well, the 17th of what? Are you referring to this? This has to be done by December 17th.
I apologize. Can we move to deal with this next week at our next meeting?
Well, It's up to you. It's up to the committee. I'll go to Mr. Noor Mohammed first, if you don't mind, Mr. Koto, and then Mr. Courik, and then we can, with our testimony here. Go ahead, Mr.
So
Noor
perhaps I
Mohammed.
can propose the following. I think, so we've got witnesses and we've got a study that needs to start today that Mr. Champoux had put forward, and I think we've got these individuals who have given their time, and I think we should get on with that. My suggestion is this: given that the notice of meeting was for an hour, and as a result, people may have made other arrangements for other things, we've got the minister coming next week on the 6th, I believe.
Yes.
We've got our meeting on Monday. My suggestion would be that before we get into witnesses next week, we get this dealt with at the top of the meeting next week. It gives everybody time to think through how we actually deal with this. There's multiple schedules to be dealing with, an individual that is not yet in the employ of the CBC that's been called, someone that is like clearly on her way out that we have called. Yep. We've got a minister that is going on mat leave starting Monday, but is coming for her appearance. If we can work together to figure out what this looks like before the next meeting, maybe we can just get to a good place on how this is all going to work, and then we can try not to litigate it all while we've got witnesses here.
Okay. Mr. Courik and then Ms. Gainey.
So if I am correct, Chair, what was just suggested was exactly what you had planned to deal with in the second hour, to have a brief discussion about the future. So I would suggest we get on with the witnesses.
Ms. Ashton. Ms. Gainey, go ahead. Floor is yours.
I agree with my colleagues on this, just that we punt this to next week and we move ahead with the witnesses.
Okay, Ms. Ashton. Ms. Ashton?
Yeah, just my concern that we only have 1 hour with witnesses today, and they heroically came on very short notice, so I'm keen to move forward with the meeting and discuss the details with respect to the motion that we passed in the House at our earliest convenience.
Okay. Thank you very much. Saying that then, we have 1 hour till 5:30 with our witnesses today. And we have, Mr. Champoux, go ahead.
On a discuté déjà.
Well, we have already spent around 10 minutes or so, so 1 hour with the witnesses that we have today will be shortened furthermore. So can we ask the witnesses if they can stay for a full hour and we go beyond 5:30 with agreement of the committee, of course, so that we can actually use all of the time, if everyone's okay?
How about you people? Fine? Fine on everybody? Yeah, we're conservatives, liberals, fine to go to about 5:40? Which would be an hour, okay. So thank you. We'll deal with this then on Monday. I just thought I would get ahead of everybody, but I see Monday is when we're going to talk about it. So welcome, guests. As an individual, Yiping G, a family doctor, thank you for coming here today to talk about freedom of expression. We have the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Christine Van Guy, is it? The litigation director, and then we have with us the research chair, France Quebec, on contemporary issues of freedom of expression. We have Mathilde Baraban, co-chair, Pierre Rainville, co-chair. We'll get to you in a moment, but the procedure here is 5 minutes for the three groups. So for Mathilde and Pierre, you can share your 5 minutes if you wish, because you're one organization, and then we'll move on. So Mr. G, family doctor, I will give you the floor for 5 minutes, your opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Yipeng G. I'm a family doctor currently practicing in primary care and refugee health in Ottawa. I completed my medical school at the University of Ottawa and was awarded the Anne C. Amberg Prize, a convocation award for the best combination of academic accomplishment and sensitivity to community health issues. I completed my Master's of Public Health and Social Behavior with a certificate in Public Health Leadership from Harvard University. Also, as a scholar and practitioner of anti-racism and health equity, I was on the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Anti-Racism Advisory Committee, and I helped develop anti-racism education for the University of Ottawa's Department of Family Medicine. During my time at Harvard University was when I first visited Palestine. I deepened my learning on settler colonialism and bearing witness to apartheid and occupation as determinants of Palestinian health, as this has been my area of study here on Turtle Island related to Indigenous health in Canada. I was a resident in public health and preventive medicine at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Medicine. I sat on Faculty Council, the highest governing committee for the faculty, and I was on the board of directors for the Canadian Medical Association last year. I learned intimately this past year that the boundaries of freedom of expression in Canada have been severely limited as it pertains to speech in support of health and human rights for Palestinians and Palestine. My experience of institutional anti-Palestinian racism and limitations on our freedom of speech parallels the stories of many who have chosen to speak out about human rights violations in Palestine. Anti-Palestinian racism is a form of racism and discrimination adjacent to Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, but also distinct from both. It is a form of racism that seeks to silence, exclude, erase, stereotype, dehumanize Palestinians and their allies. This often results in severe sanctions and disciplinary actions that profoundly impact the lives of Palestinians and their allies, a practice which has been advised against by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. This is a freedom of expression issue. Last year around this time, a family doctor and faculty member shared my social media posts and publicly mischaracterized them as anti-Semitic and inflammatory and sent them to the university and the Canadian Medical Association. He was someone that was neither a patient nor a direct colleague or supervisor of mine. My social media posts were from my personal accounts, and in no way was I trying to speak from any of my places of employment or affiliation. These posts were criticized as being inflammatory, racist, and anti-Semitic simply because they advocated for Palestinians having the same human rights as everyone else, aligning with international law. I met with senior leadership of the Canadian Medical Association, and my social media posts were criticized, and I was pressured to put together a public apology and provide personal one-on-one apologies to certain people in high-ranking positions and who hold influence in the association. Soon after, I received a phone call from the university informing me of my immediate and indefinite suspension, citing a Level 3 breach of professionalism for my social media posts. A Level 3 professionalism breach means repeated instances of an individual's behavior and conduct despite intervention or a concern for the individual's clinical care or quality of care of services. No prior conversations were held, nor were concerns ever raised regarding my social media posts or professionalism before. Patient safety was raised as a concern. However, in my duties as a resident in public health, I was completing a rotation at the Public Health Agency of Canada without any individuals working under me who I was responsible for supervising, and also without direct patient contact. The university's professionalism subcommittee, who reviewed my case, recommended immediate reinstatement without any disciplinary action. They suggested an apology be issued by the university, which they never gave. I feel deeply harmed by the university in causing emotional and psychological distress, and has permanently altered my career path in public health. As I sat on faculty council this past year, I witnessed multiple cases of medical students' social media posts be discussed as professionalism concerns, and it was clear that a fair process was not being followed. It was shared during these meetings that there were no clear bylaws or processes, and their legal counsel was creating the processes as they went. There were statements shared in these meetings that were rooted in anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Muslim, and anti-Arab hate without any accountability. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario has informed me of multiple complaints against me of a similar nature related to social media posts and not related to my clinical competency and conduct within the clinical setting. This is taking away time and resources from me, my legal counsel, and ultimately the college itself in managing legitimate cases related to professional competence and conduct. My purpose today is to ask the Standing Committee for support in holding institutions to account for overstepping in their policing of people's right to free speech and to recognize the appalling normalization of anti-Palestinian racism in educational institutions and places of employment, such as the University of Ottawa and the Canadian Medical Association. This is a non-partisan issue. There are solutions that are already being proposed, including a Conservative Private Members Bill C-257 titled An Act to Amend the Canadian Human Rights Act, Protecting Against Discrimination Based on Political Belief. Last week, the Alberta Premier, along with the Justice Minister, said that their government will review professional regulatory bodies such as the College of Physicians and Surgeons, which plays the important role of regulating professional competence and conduct, and introduce legislation next year to limit how they can police their own members on their speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. G. Right on the 5 minutes. We'll go now to the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and we have Christine Van Gyn, who is the litigation director on Zoom here. So, Christine, for 5 minutes, please, your opening statements.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me today. I'm the litigation director with the CCF, which is a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada. And I am fascinated by the question that's been proposed by the committee today, which is the means government should have at its disposal to ensure the exercise of freedom of expression. And frankly, the government does not need more means. The government needs to do less. We already have the right to freedom of expression guaranteed in Section 2B of the Charter. Before the Charter, we had the right to freedom of expression protected in the Constitution Act 1867, which is similar in principle to the United Kingdom, whose unwritten constitution protects the right of public discussion. We are not granted these rights to freedom of expression by our government. We possess them by virtue of being human beings. And throughout human history, it's the government that's the greatest threat to our right to free speech, whether it was the execution of Socrates for his public philosophy or the brutal Star Chamber of King Henry VII, who punished those who printed without a license, or the attempted censorship of New York newsman Peter Zenger for his criticism of the American colonial government. Governments have tried to censor speech that they don't like as long as we have had governments. And it's hard for me to even know where to start on this question. Do I talk about the threat to freedom of the press, the problem with imprisoning people for words alone, the problem with using human rights tribunals to regulate art and comedy, or as Dr. G brought up, how professional regulators are undermining the right of freedom of speech of so many Canadians in those professions? These are all real, live issues today, and the source of the problem is government. On free press, consider the Alberta press case, which involved a law that compelled newspapers to publish government rebuttals to criticism. That case was from 1937, so fears about the so-called fake news or misinformation are not new. But even though the Supreme Court struck down that Alberta law, the silencing of the press continues today. For example, we had the CCF challenge an amendment to the Canadian Elections Act that ended up being struck down in 2019. That was a provision that prohibited the false statements about political candidates during an election period, and it even captured innocent statements and mistakes and had fines up to $50,000 and 5 years in prison. We were successful in having it struck down. And while not censorship in the classic sense, millions of Canadians have lost access to news because of this government's Online News Act, done in the name of saving the news industry. The act has backfired spectacularly, with Meta refusing to comply and blocking news on its platforms. There's the Online Streaming Act brought by this government, which put the CRTC in charge of regulating content from companies like YouTube, Netflix, and Spotify, including user-generated content. And the free press is essential. It's an essential check on the authoritarian impulses of government, and the actions of this government continue to undermine it. On the criminal law power, censorship through criminalizing words is nothing new, even though we're well aware of the problems with it. Consider Quebecois Jehovah's Witness Amy Boucher, who in the 1940s was convicted of seditious libel for accusing the Quebec government of being too close to the Catholic Church. That is a viewpoint that was condemned at the time, but perhaps mainstream today. And consider how expressing the idea that gay people should have equal rights was an unacceptable view 60 years ago, but thanks to the free speech of people who publicly advocated for change, we have equal rights now in Canada for the LGBTQ community. Free speech is important for those who are in minorities, whether they're a minority viewpoint or a minority in some immutable characteristic. Free speech is how we define the contours of our other rights. It is not a value for the right or the left. It is a nonpartisan right for all Canadians, yet this government continues to undermine it. One of the purposes of free expression is to allow for debate on even the most controversial topics, because vigorous debate is how we best settle our disagreements, including disagreements about who should lead government. Free debate on contentious issues can't happen if the people currently in government are allowed to outlaw opposing point of views. The right to express your words and ideas goes to the core of who we are as individuals. The government doesn't need more means. It needs to stop trying to silence speech.
Thank you very much. Right on time, Ms. Jine. And we're moved now to the Shell de Recherche, France, Quebec. And we're going to, pardon my English, we're going to start 5 minutes. Mr. Rainville, I think you're You're up first, and you may share your time or you may not, but you're free to. You've got 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je tiens à remercier les membres.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the members of the committee for the invitation. You've invited us to talk to you about a very special fundamental right, which is the freedom of expression, and it's more than a fundamental right. It's the cornerstone of the vast majority of fundamental rights. There can be no freedom of religion, for instance, without freedom of speech. It's also a good idea to take stock before suggesting ways of protecting freedom of expression. First observation, it's all too easy to forget that words or comments that are disturbing or that might make others angry fall precisely within the scope of freedom of expression. The Supreme Court is a constant reminder of this. Second observation, freedom of expression is sometimes abused even by federal regulators and the Canadian Parliament itself. Illustrations, examples, let's start with the CRTC. In 2020, Radio-Canada broadcast the title of a book that some may find offensive. However, the book is not racist. It is one of the works that left its mark on Quebec in the 1970s. The CRTC blamed Radio-Canada and even demanded a written public apology from the corporation. The Fédération professionnelle des journalistes du Québec is alarmed by this decision, and the Federal Court of Appeal intervenes, and they criticize the CRTC for ignoring freedom of expression and underestimating the risk of self-censorship created by its own decision. The Canadian Parliament is not above reproach either. Take the brand new crime of Holocaust denial adopted in 2022. It was rushed through, and it was buried in a 450-page budget bill. The Senate Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs lamented this course of action, and so did the Canadian Bar Association. The procedure that was used does not provide parliamentarians with the framework for analysis that is required when a law infringes on freedom of expression. And my point here is simple. Institutional and parliamentary safeguards must be put in place to ensure that bills that hinder freedom of expression are not rushed through. Another example is the current Bill C-63 on online harms. And I'll be clear, this bill is legitimate and valid on many fronts, but there are some provisions that actually undermine artistic creation and that go against that contravene the teachings of the Supreme Court of Canada. And I can go into detail if you wish. And another grievance is that it prohibits the advising of certain perfectly licit, so lawful sexual activities. This infringement of freedom of expression is flagrant. One solution would be to consider passing a law proclaiming the importance of freedom of artistic and journalistic expression, as other states have done. And this would be a law that would also reiterate that simply offending others is not a valid reason for gagging speech. Our research chair is taking stock of the current state of freedom of expression, focusing in particular on 3 freedoms, which are the freedom of religion, academic freedom, and the freedom of creation. And I will talk about the last one. There are 22 countries in the world that have enshrined the freedom of artistic expression in their constitutions. And many others, such as France since 2016, have a law to protect this particular form of expression. Canada, for its part, has yet to see the need for such a specific protection. If France and other countries have chosen to provide greater protection for creative freedom, it's because art is an expression that often challenges the norms of what is good and beautiful, and in this respect is disturbing. But for this very reason, it can foster the democratic process, the search for truth, and contribute to personal fulfillment, which are the main Canadian principles for the protection of freedom of speech. While the Supreme Court has recognized that artistic expression is at the heart of the values relating to freedom of expression, and while Canadian Parliament sometimes vote motions in support of abused artists, we have to admit that this recognition and support are more timid here than in other countries, and especially in European bodies. And yet this protection has rarely been so necessary. In fact, for some time now in Canada, as we see in Europe and in the United States, a number of political groups have been using art controversies to advance their cause. Art is thus at the center of both a conservative cultural war and progressive struggles. The former attacks cultural productions that consider sexual and ethnic diversity. The latter is waging a blitzkrieg around famous works of art to draw attention to the climate emergency, for instance, or denounce sexism and racism in art. As my field studies in Quebec's cultural milieu have confirmed, the work of cultural institutions has become considerably more complicated in recent years, and self-censorship is becoming entrenched. Perhaps additional constitutional or legislative protection would help solve the problem, but above all, Canada needs to develop a culture of freedom of artistic expression, and to achieve this, more modest actions than a legislative project could already be taken, and I'd like to discuss this matter in further detail.
Thank you, Ms. Barabant. Okay, so how it works for the first round will be 6 minutes. We'll start with the Conservative Party. Mr. Giovanni, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, certainly this is a very important topic, and I appreciate the witnesses for being here. I do have some questions for Ms. Van Geyn, who I think gave an excellent set of opening remarks. And Ms. Van Geyn, I'd like to speak with you in particular about Justin Trudeau's censorship agenda, which has been implemented by the Liberal Party, certainly with help from the NDP. And when we talk about the censorship agenda, we're talking about primarily two pieces of legislation, Bill C-11 and C-18. Ms. Van Geyn, I'm sure you're familiar with them, but just for the sake of being on the same page, Bill C-11, of course, refers to the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and the federal bureaucracy gaining more control over what Canadians can access on streaming platforms online. Bill C-18, of course, refers to Justin Trudeau and the federal bureaucracy having more control over the news that Canadians can see, which is limited access that Canadians have to news on platforms like Facebook and Instagram. So I'd like to start with just asking Ms. Van Geyn, do you share the concerns of many Canadians who are worried about Justin Trudeau's censorship agenda and Bill C-11 and C-18?
I would add to that list Bill C-63, which has the potential to be one of the most censorious pieces of legislation that I've seen in a really long time. C-63, the Online Harms Act, would increase penalties for criminalized speech and hate-motivated crimes to life in prison, which part of the concern around that is using these heightened penalties to overcharge criminal defendants and create pressure for plea deals for lower level offenses when there is an argument that the Crown might make that there is a hate element. Even if it's not present, it can be charged, and this overcharging leads to pressure to plead out. Another concern we have about C-63 is that it would allow for someone who fears a future hate crime speech, that they can request a judge to put conditions on the would-be speaker, things like an ankle monitor or even imprisonment. And this is for future speech that has not yet taken place. This is incredibly chilling. C-63 would also create a civil mechanism for people to complain about speech to the Human Rights Commission. It's a return of Section 13 of the Canada Human Rights Act, which was rightly repealed for dragging before the Commission journalists and members of the clergy. There is no cost to bringing a complaint, but there's great cost to the complained about. And we have seen human rights tribunals bring claims, bring before them comedians. That's in a Quebec context. So giving this power to these commissions will chill expression. I did not have time in my 5 minutes to mention C-63, and I understand that there is a separate committee hearing that will address that, but I wanted to put on the record our serious concern about that. With respect to the Online News Act and the Online Streaming Act, While perhaps not censorship in the most classic form, I do share the concerns of millions of Canadians who have lost access to news as a result of the Online News Act. I share the concerns of a lot of academics and Canadian content creators about the regulation of user-generated content on social media platforms like YouTube. I'm a YouTube creator myself. I have one of the largest, I think probably the largest YouTube channel about Canadian constitutional law, perhaps niche.
If I could just ask
and it will censor that.
Ms. Van Guyen, if I could just ask a follow-up to that, because the Trudeau Liberals very much like to misrepresent their censorship agenda as being solely focused on big corporations. But as you noted, it does include...
Mr. Chair. Well, I do want to hear Mr. Giovanni's question. He's making an assertion as to what our intention is, which I think is you have ruled before.
Well, you
is
didn't
not
let me finish
reasonable.
the question, so you're getting ahead of yourself.
Didn't even need to get
I know
there.
you're
You
an eager
already
guy.
said it.
I know you're an eager guy. So if I could just ask the question to Ms. Van Guyen, you mentioned that user-generated content is included in Justin Trudeau's censorship agenda, which law professor Michael Geist has detailed in a series of blogs explaining that it is not just a matter of focusing on corporations. What is the importance of this censorship agenda, including user-generated content?
A short answer of 20 seconds, please.
The effect is that it puts the government putting its thumb on the scale of what content Canadians see, and that in itself is inherently censorious.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Van Guyen and Mr. Giovanni. We'll move to the Liberals now for 6 minutes. Ms. Dillon, please, for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma première question.
Thank you, Chair. My first question will be for Ms. Baraban. You spoke about creative freedom and academic freedom of expression, and you also said that there are other countries that have enshrined this in law. Here in Canada, how can we do it? Well, it's a recommendation from UNESCO to equip oneself with legislation that would protect artistic creation and expression. This has multiple facets. It includes the protection of expression, so the production and sharing of art, but also it encompasses the status of artists. So I think here in this committee you have produced a report on these questions, on these issues. In Quebec, there is a law on the status of artists. It's work in progress, though. So there is ground for further reflection on how specifically these types of expression can be protected and the risks they involve, because artists have been having hard times since 2018 for a whole host of reasons. And you can also draw inspiration from countries such as France, who have recently adopted a law to protect artistic expression. That's just one example. So, can you give us an example from France of how artistic expression is protected, or what forms? Well, all forms. It doesn't necessarily have to have artistic value. It just needs to have artistic intent. For instance, this applies to cinema, to live performances, to museums. So it encompasses all forms of art that now benefit from increased protections. Thank you. So you also spoke in your testimony, in your opening remarks rather, about these issues, but you touched upon political controversies and that sometimes issues are politicized. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? Of course, that comes up quite often on field work that I do when we speak to actors, and from the cultural milieu in France and in Quebec, we can draw parallels and make comparisons. So it allows us to look beyond the horizons of our own country. So there's also the ties with the rest of Canada, which are equally valuable. So participants in my studies have told me that they have been suffering more and more pressures, and these come from their target audience, but also from the patrons who are financing the artistic work. And I would also say that there are political requirements that further complicate their relationship with their target audience. I gave two completely different examples. I spoke about the conservative cultural war, and I also talk about progressive struggles. And people that I have spoken to do not always have the same stance regarding these two phenomena. They clearly refer to self-censoring, especially in libraries, that there are pressures to cancel events which would otherwise feature drag queens, for instance, that would come in and read books, or there are pressures on work that focuses on issues of racism and gender. So in these cases, library professionals, for instance, are asking for more protection to keep doing these important activities. So I would put the spotlight on these sorts of examples, but there is also a willingness to self-regulate around other issues. So people from the cultural milieu are sometimes favorable towards these. For instance, the issue of colonialization of art, or the fight against discrimination in the arts circles. And here they would seek to get tools to self-regulate and to react to these different themes and issues. Thank you.
Seconds. The first round, 6 minutes, so go ahead. You've got 50 seconds.
OK, perfect. Alors, est-ce que vous voulez continuer ou vous avez presque...
Do you want to keep going? Well, listen, I think that was it. I think that was everything. I found this very interesting. So I don't know if you'd be able to answer in the remaining time, but what would you say about technology and the freedom of expression, quickly, if possible? Well, its connection to art is my field of specialization. I could talk about that. There are growing concerns around artificial intelligence in art, in intellectual property, for instance, is directly impacted. In some cases, some professions could be replaced by AI. So I have also had participants in my studies that have made those points.
Both of you will move to the block. Mr. Shampoo for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup. Merci aux témoins d'être avec nous.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today, and you made it to this meeting with a very short heads up. Mr. Ranville, Ms. Baraban, I think you read my notes before doing my opening remarks. You answered all of my questions in 5 minutes. You were concise, and you touched upon almost all fields, all areas of life, most at least that are of interest for me. But you also opened the door to many other questions, because when you talk about artistic freedom and the freedom of expression for creators and artists, I think we are going through a crisis in the past couple of years. So there are works of art that have been created and put under the spotlight by certain groups for cultural appropriation. So how does one provide a framework for the freedom of creation and artistic freedom without encroaching upon freedom of expression in the general sense, without offending by the content? Or how do you, in this context, reassure artists that they can create freely? Because that's a challenge, and you referred to this in your opening remarks. Artists are starting to self-censor because this pressure is coming onto them from others. Well, when it comes to the Slav and Kanata, I think that was a very interesting point that you made. This was a show that was good intentioned, that was anti-racist, but it was actually not welcomed by anti-racism groups. This show was going to depict scenes of slavery, but there were no people of African descent. And there were white people who were singing the songs. So people took issue with that. But what's interesting in that case is that it got a lot of reaction, especially from the arts circles in Quebec. People refer to censorship, but we have to remind ourselves that the protesters were exercising their freedom of expression. So I think it's important not to get confused when it comes to censorship or state control and the exercise of one's freedom of expression, which could sometimes be not so palatable for others. And the shows took place in a heightened state of tension, and the patrons decided to cancel some of these shows. So I think we have to ask questions about the real responsibilities of the different stakeholders in all this, and just raise awareness around, for instance, patrons as to the importance of freedom of expression, and to let them know that they have a very, very, very big responsibility in all of this. And that is why I was referring to a key issue, which is to develop a culture of freedom of expression in general, and freedom of artistic creation and expression as well. Go ahead, please. I think it is crucial to remind that we have to remind ourselves the decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada. And it is clear in their rulings that in a democratic society, people have the right to be disturbing in their comments and actions. It is also clear that there are pressures and there are struggles in artistic circles as well. But it's only normal. But maybe we should also talk about freedom of expression being about expressing oneself, but also about receiving comments and information. When a work of art is not welcome, then there is the other side of the coin, if you want. And sometimes, in my opinion, on a personal note, we have seen excessive reaction. This is not a comment that comes from my institution per se. Specifically, this is a personal opinion. But again, the freedom of expression also covers receiving, the receiving facet of getting information. Yeah, the right of not being offended doesn't really exist. But can you introduce a framework around the freedom of expression? Because we can talk about maybe measures to protect the freedom and the right of expression and freedom, artistic expression. Can we introduce guardrails, for instance, and take different measures to introduce a framework without people complaining that these guidelines or guardrails are actually encroaching upon the freedom of expression? We hear this in more right-wing or more conservative rhetoric, who are defending no regulation, no rules whatsoever, but can we have consensus in that kind of a framework? Well, the current climate isn't really open to the creation of consensus, if you will, but if we want to promote freedom of artistic creation and expression, anything that resembles regulation isn't really well received. In Quebec, we have seen criticism in this sense as well. While I didn't really have a particular position on that, but it was a slippery slope. But it allows us to better appreciate the importance of journalistic integrity and independence and artistic creation as well.
To the NDP, Nikki Ashton, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I'll begin my questions with Dr. Gu. Dr. Gu, it's clear that your story demonstrates society's limit of freedom of expression, especially when it comes to speaking up on Palestine. Looking at the horrors being inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza during the current onslaught by Israel, you called it, quote, apartheid upon Palestinian people, end quote, settler colonialism, end quote. Then a colleague publicly criticized you and the school suspended you, citing a breach of professional standards. This didn't come from your patients. This didn't come from anyone you work with directly. Your suspension meant that projects you were working on, including ones on behalf of the Public Health Agency of Canada, did not continue. This has had a direct negative impact on Canadians. But your suspension didn't only penalize you, it also punished the people who, as a medical resident, rely on you. Due to the fallout from your suspension, the residency program lost its program director and obviously possible threats to its accreditation, the worst possible outcome. Can you describe how your suspension had a negative impact on critical work in healthcare, particularly public health, for Canadians?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So before I was suspended, I was working in public health and, also, appreciating the structural determinants of health, including the impacts of colonialism here from Turtle Island to Palestine. And when I think about the role that medicine as an institution has played historically and ongoing in things like justifying slavery and forced sterilization of Indigenous women, nutritional experimentation of Indigenous children. These are the realities that we face in building trust with our patients who are the most vulnerable and the most structurally oppressed. And when that is the work of trying to move anti-racism and health equity forward in this oppressive colonial structure of medicine within Canada, it becomes really challenging to do that work when we're faced with investigations and discipline as healthcare workers, as physicians working in this space. And I think on top of that, the suspension that I experienced also had chilling effects on my colleagues and other learners and faculty within the institution, but also across Canada. I know of a plastic surgeon who served with Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, in Gaza in December of last year, who returned to Ottawa to work and wanted to speak about what she had seen in Gaza, but because she saw my suspension and the impacts of it on me and others, the silencing, this chilling effect of anti-Palestinian racism, she ended up not doing a grand round presentation with other colleagues. So when this is the reality for freedom of expression, for physicians who are simply wanting to call for an end to genocide that is being supported by this country, that we need to be able to criticize the actions of our country, criticize the actions of other countries in their genocidal colonial violence as it continues to this day.
Thank you, Dr. Gu. You talked about the chilling effect and impacts on others. I just want to take it back a step. We know that freedom of expression is critical to a healthy democracy. It is seen as a fundamental right here in Canada, and yet your experience proves that Canadians, such as yourself, are targeted for speaking out in favor of human rights, in favor of peace, in favor of international law. I'm wanting to ask you, you spoke of the example of this plastic surgeon. Have you connected with others? Have others come to you to speak about how speaking out about Palestine has had a negative impacts on their livelihoods, on their reputations? What have you heard from others, whether it's in the medical field or beyond?
Because of my experience, I've had many folks, both in the medical profession, but also in other sectors, including in education, reach out to me to express the levels of silencing and discipline that they have been facing. I've also heard it from public servants and diplomats, people who work within these institutions that do not feel like they can voice any dissent or any criticism of the policies related to the Canadian policies related to what is happening and unfolding in Gaza. And when this is the reality, it becomes impossible to find a path forward for peace and justice for Palestinians in the region. I think it's also really important to recognize that the ways in which it manifests really represent bullying, harassment, intimidation from colleagues who just want to suppress any speech in support of human rights and dignities for Palestine and Palestinians.
Thank you, Dr. Good. And with the remaining moments that I have, I'm wondering if you can share with us what can politicians do to protect the voices of people like yourself who are speaking out and calling for action on to end genocide, for human rights, for peace, for justice.
About 20 seconds.
Yeah, there was the Conservative Private Members Bill that I mentioned earlier, but also I think there's a role for policymakers and parliamentarians here to defend the right to free speech so that we don't fully descend into a fascist government like what we are seeing in Israel. To be able to protect our free speech, to be able to criticize and find constructive ways forward so we center human rights and people and care and dignity is the utmost thing that we can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ashton. We'll move to the second round. Conservative Party, Mr. Gord. 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses. My first question will be for Mr. Ranville. Bills such as C11, C18, they try to put guardrails around the freedom of expression in Canada, but there's a thin line here between what's possible, what's acceptable. Where do you draw the line? Well, fortunately, we have had lines, if you will, drawn by the Supreme Court of Canada. With C63, for instance, that was the case. And in many regards, we have remained loyal to the rulings of the court in the past 15 years. So when we talk about the protection of the freedom of speech, hate speech, for instance, is not covered, it's not included. And in 2013, we had another law that was abrogated. But the Supreme Court of Canada had already declared that its dispositions were valid. But there's another aspect of this legislation that is bothering me, and it went unnoticed. It's the victimization, sexual victimization as defined by the Bill of Children. And I'll give you one example, among others, maybe two examples. This bill does not keep the provisions of the criminal law. Of course, it's not a criminal piece of legislation, but there are aspects that touch upon artistic creation, and it applies to all forms of expression. But in C63, these means of defense applies to images, photography, etc., but bizarrely, it's not retained for written speech. So we are talking about artistic freedom, creation, but it's undermined in this way. Because if there's a photo, well, artistic protection is proclaimed and valid, but in written works, it wouldn't be in that case. Now, another example, the bill would prohibit writing a piece of written work that would talk about certain sexual relations, for instance, relations between an adult and an adolescent. And I think that this is quite surprising. But again, I don't mean to say that the bill should be thrown in the bin, but there are some significant pitfalls in terms of the freedom of expression. So the CRTC could be called upon to control content as per the bill. What do you think? Well, I'll give you an example from a ruling of the federal court from last year. And in a very diplomatic manner, they reproached the CRTC because this was a majority decision and they really did not refer to the freedom of expression, and they asked for written apology in that case. And the dissenting judges, or rather the federal court, said that it was surprising that there was no reference to that, and the journalistic freedom was being undermined. So I think all legislative measures should be crafted in a very thoughtful manner in order not to undermine freedom of journalism. There has to be guidelines that need to be measured. But I think initially the CRTC should be asked to take into account the principle of the freedom of expression, the freedom of the press, and journalistic independence in decisions delivered by the CRTC, but that is not the case. Well, we have been talking about foreign interference to intimidate Canadians and to infringe upon their freedom of expression. So you started providing an answer. Maybe you can continue to provide a written comment too. While the Supreme Court had a ruling about fake news, many people think that legislators cannot intervene because of this decision, but I don't think that's a healthy line of thinking. In France, for instance, there's a very limited law on electoral law that prohibits the massive diffusion of fake news, not just simple opinions, but fake news that are objectively verifiable when this comes from a foreign state. And when it tries to interfere with the results of the elections, that is possible in France, and they can do that.
Move on for 5 minutes. Mr. Noor Mohammed from the Liberal Party. 5 minutes. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are for, I want to start by, first of all, thanking all of the witnesses for being here. And I'd like to start by asking Ms. Van Geyn, did I get your name correctly? Because people get my name wrong all the time. I must make sure I get it right. Is it Van Geyn or Van Geyn?
Share your issue. It's Van Geyn. Like
Van Geyn. Perfect. Thank you. I just want to, if you could just take a moment to clarify for me something that I want to make sure I heard correctly. When you were talking about Bill C-63, did you say that we were too tough, the law was too tough on hate speech?
Yeah, so
Okay.
I think that the issue is with statutizing the definition, which is an inherently subjective definition. I think that there's an issue with the ability to add a new penalty when there's another offense committed to basically overcharge defendants.
Got it. Okay, so
I can give
so,
you.
no, that's fine. So I guess what I want to dig into is, what would you say to members of the Jewish community or the Muslim community who right now who are seeing incredible spikes in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that is resulting in violent physical assaults on people and institutions? The argument many of them make is that hate speech leads to these things, these types of actions. Would you agree with that?
So violence is, of course, criminalized already, and I think that there's an issue with all kinds of things like bail conditions that repeat violent offenders are not actually put in prison. So please, criminalize violence. Put people who commit violent acts.
No, but my question is, do you believe that there is a correlation between incitement and hate speech and people's responses, or do you think that people act independent of those two things?
So incitement to violence is also criminalized, and
Okay.
we take no issue with incitement to violence.
Okay. So let's just, I appreciate very much you speaking about the importance of freedom. Do you believe in freedom of expression as being beyond just words?
Of course.
Okay. So do you think that a woman should be able to wear a niqab?
Of course I do.
Do you think that it was inappropriate for the Conservative government to put forward, in the last time that Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, do you think it was inappropriate for them to put forward a niqab ban on women?
I don't have a comment on that. I'm not familiar.
No, but I'm not asking you. So, okay. So you're not familiar with the proposed
I do
niqab
not
ban?
think that government should ban religious clothing.
So you do not think that government should ever ban religious clothing, correct?
I do not think they should,
Okay.
including the Quebec government, which is doing that now.
Do you believe in a woman's right to choose?
Of course I do.
Do you think that is it
To choose how to access healthcare, you mean? Like to choose
whether or not she can get an abortion?
Yes. That's my personal viewpoint.
Fantastic.
I do believe
Does it concern you? Does it concern you that conservative governments in certain provinces, and does it concern you that members of the Conservative Party are seeking to legislate eliminating or taking away a woman's right to choose?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
I'm asking you specifically if a conservative.
We're talking about abortion right now.
I'm asking you that because I'm asking you if you believe in that freedom.
That is what the connection is.
I'm asking you if you
Mr.
believe
Speaker,
in that
point of order
freedom.
here. What's the relevance to this?
Point of order.
Expression. Freedom of expression. Expression takes different forms. Well, I've asked the question, and as you well
Yeah,
know,
but
I'm
you're
just asking-
pounding her now. That's the point.
Oh, now you're concerned. Okay, great. Okay, let's.
I don't feel hounded. I just don't understand.
Okay, let me ask the question differently. Do you?
I believe people have the right to express their views on abortion.
Okay. Do you believe that people have the right to legislate whether or not a woman has the right to choose?
I mean, now you're talking about sort of parliamentary sovereignty issues, which are well beyond the scope of. I mean, Parliament can legislate on all kinds of things, and then they're put in check by the Supreme Court. I really don't.
Okay. So.
Do legislation as. Like Parliament is sovereign.
So if Parliament decided, so if Parliament decided to do certain things and pass certain laws, then that would be sovereign, and that would be the law, and that's what we should all adhere to, and there should be no opposition. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm a little confused by the line of questioning. Parliament can legislate. Legislation is subject to our Constitution, which can then be reviewed by the court.
So we can get more into this later. Are you concerned? Or were you concerned when the former premier of New Brunswick, who has recently transitioned into being the former premier and Premier Moe in Nova Scotia, are trying to put restrictions on a child's right to use the pronouns that they want to use?
That's an issue that we haven't taken a position on at the CCF.
I'm asking you your opinion, though. I'm asking you your opinion.
I'm here speaking as a representative of an organization. I'm not going to give you my opinion on that particular issue, which is a live issue.
Okay, and my final question to you.
You're at 5:10, so I got to move on. Okay. 2.5 to Mr. Shampoo of the Block.
Merci. 2 minutes et demie, c'est très rapide.
Thank you. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. We'll go very quickly. You were talking about C63 and its shortcomings, but do you think that a regulation for online hate speech that would comply with the civil law or criminal law, is that necessary? And would it encroach upon the freedom of expression or the multiple types of freedoms, because it's a large field? Well, initially, I think it's important to reassure oneself every now and then. The bill actually refers to the guidelines introduced by the Supreme Court. Offending and vexing, it doesn't amount to the level of hate crime. So we need to see that in a piece of legislation, not just a court ruling. That would send a good signal. That would refer to the criminal law and other pieces of legislation on that front. I think it's useful, but we have ground to have concerns because there needs to be more limits introduced to its scope. Well, you were saying that it has its shortcomings, but we shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, I agree with that comment. We were talking about artistic and academic freedom. We talked about all forms of freedom of expression. In the criminal law, there is a religion exception that allows individuals to hold very violent remarks, very hateful remarks, and do that without any punishment because, well, they're covered by their religious beliefs. Do you think that this goes beyond what we should be tolerating as part of freedom of expression? And here I'd like to draw a parallel and ask the question, and up to what point can we push this idea to protect artistic freedom? Because again, on that front, we see very violent things under the pretext of artistic freedom. So how far can we go by respecting these boundaries? I apologize, my question was long. While for criminal code provisions, while it is an attempt to find the balance between religion and the freedom of expression, that it dates back quite a while. But in some cases, we have seen the proof that people who have held remarks, they wanted to incite hate against a community.
I'm going to move to Nikki Ashton, NDP, 2.5 minutes.
And my question is to Dr. Gu. In the 1970s, provisions were added to the criminal code that prohibit the promotion of genocide and the incitement of hatred towards identifiable groups. The Harper Conservatives work hard to remove a number of these protections, but the Supreme Court has been clear that the promotion of hate propaganda doesn't contribute and, in fact, quote, distorts or limits the robust and free exchange of ideas by its tendency to silence the voice of its target groups, end quote. When the conservative leader describes how Israel expanding its bombing campaign as a, quote, gift to the world, end quote, or when the Liberal Prime Minister sends weapons that could be used for what the ICJ considers a plausible genocide, are these not escalations? Are these not acts of hate? If we're going to talk about the role of government vis-a-vis freedom of expression and the need to protect freedom of expression, but taking a clear stand against hate, can we not talk about this willful incitement of hate by two of the most powerful political figures in Canada at this time?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. These are examples of not only manufactured consent for genocide, but explicit monetary and material support for genocide. There should most certainly be guardrails for the freedom of expression around manufacturing consent for genocide, as per these two examples that you were given. And I would argue that to kind of incite such kind of to commend genocidal violence, that genocidal colonial violence that Israel is committing, and to allow that to extend beyond Palestine into Lebanon and into other multiple countries in the region, is entirely unbecoming of a Canadian politician. And for the other Canadian politician that you mentioned, who is materially aiding Israel in its genocidal campaign against Palestinians, those most certainly are need to be held accountable in both freedom of expression limitations and setting appropriate guardrails, but also accountability around the actual literal funding and support for a genocide that is unfolding before our eyes, and that is before the courts, including the International Court of Justice.
10 seconds left.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gu. I want to take the opportunity to thank you for coming to our committee and thank you for sharing your strength and courage. You speak on behalf of many, and I certainly hope that this committee will take seriously what you've shared with us about how people are paying the price for freedom of expression in our country right now when in speaking up for human rights, for peace, for justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ashton. I'll make an editorial decision. Because we started late, the final round with the Conservatives and Liberals will go 4 minutes each. Mr. Courig for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and appreciate our witnesses being here, although I do find it astounding that that the NDP and Dr. Guy just suggested that for somehow the leader of the opposition was guilty of a criminal offense for standing up for Jews having the right to their own state. I would, however, Ms. Van Geyn, Bill C-11.
Point of order.
Point of order, Ms. Ashton.
Yeah, I think we need to be accurate. Nobody said such a thing. And the quote that I shared was with respect to Israel's bombing. Let the record show exactly what was said rather than conservative interpretations.
Okay, move on. Mr. Courig, please.
Canadians can judge for themselves. Ms. Van Geyn, when it comes to Bill C-11, do you see it in conflict with the basic freedoms that Canadians are guaranteed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
I do. I do have issues with C-11. In particular, the ability of the CRTC to regulate user-generated content. That, I think, is the biggest concern. The analogy that a lot of us who are online content creators, Canadians, have given is if a bookstore is ordered by the government to put certain books in the window and certain books at the back, would we view that as a censorious government act? And that is the analogy that a lot of us in that ecosystem have been using related to what the C11 CRTC power to put its thumb on the algorithm is doing.
If I could, just because time is so short, it's been described largely as backdoor censorship. The Justin Trudeau and the Liberal censorship agenda. They're not telling people that they can't believe something, but they're restricting through technological means, algorithms, the content that's available. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that you could describe it as backdoor censorship. It's not censorship in the classic form, but it's a big problem.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And now I'm curious about C18. Again, do you see C18 as being in conflict with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the freedoms guaranteed for Canadians in it?
So it kind of depends on how the regulations are going to be interpreted with respect to the Online News Act. I think that it's not censorship in the classic form that we think of, but depending on how it's operationalized, there could be a charter case to be made against that particular piece of legislation.
Did you find it deeply problematic, or did you find it problematic that that as a result of C18, news content basically on some of the most used social media apps in the country was eliminated, restricting Canadians' ability to see what was happening in the world?
Yes. I mean, this was in direct response to government action. Meta took the action of blocking news on Canadian versions of their platforms, including Facebook and Instagram, and millions of Canadians were accessing news that way. It actually undermines the ability of the free press to function because of the loss of clicks, which is how some of their revenue was being generated. Sharing news is not a threat to the news industry.
So we have Bill C11, Bill C18. I know you mentioned as well Bill C63. Direct threats to Canadians and the freedoms that Canadians are guaranteed through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That certainly seems like a censorship agenda to me that needs to be fought against. Thank you very much to the witnesses for coming today.
Thank you, Mr. Couric. The final 4 minutes, we welcome Ms. Shanahan, Liberal Party. Go ahead.
Well, and normally I'd be very happy to be asking my questions, but Mr. Noor Mohammed was on such a roll, I am ceding my time to him.
Okay, he's got less than 4 minutes, about 3:50 now, but go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go, Ms. Van, you and I were having a conversation, so I'd like to go back to that if we could. Are there limits? Should there be limits to freedom of speech?
I mean, we're a civil liberties organization, so we believe in very broad protections for freedom of expression.
Should I be able to describe black people using the N-word?
I don't think that you should describe black people using the
But should I be allowed to?
I don't. The current law permits you to do that.
And, okay.
That's a statement of the law. That is a statement of the law is right now.
But do you consider that hate speech?
Never talk that way, and I don't think you would either.
I certainly would not. I certainly would not. My question to you, though, is if we have very broad limits to what people can say or not say, do we not start to see that there becomes risk to other people's safety and security? So, for example, if somebody were to say that, oh, all Muslims are terrorists and we need to worry about them, or all Jews support genocide, we should be worried about that, or all Chinese people are complicit with the CCP, or making nonsense statements like that, which can start to undermine people's safety and security, do you think that we should limit that, or do you think that's okay?
That's not limited currently under the law, even under hate speech law. The current hate speech law would not prohibit statements like that, as odious as they are.
But
And
that's actually not true, though. But that's simply untrue. There are.
No, it's not untrue.
It's not true. Okay, so just to go back, so we will disagree.
It would be incitement.
Okay, so incitement. Okay.
Which is a much higher threshold than what you're describing. As terrible as the speech that you're describing is, and you
Should and it should be permitted. Your position is that should continue to be permitted.
That's not even.
No, but my question to you: should it be permitted?
Government is proposing do it.
My question to you is: should that type of speech be permitted? Is it okay to say those things?
It is not okay to say those things, but it is legal to say those things in Canada.
Okay, let's move on to a topic we didn't get to because I only have a couple minutes left. One of the challenges that we have seen recently is to how it is that gender-affirming care and kids and young people and others that are not children are seeing when it comes to their rights and their freedom of expression. Do you agree or disagree with conservative politicians that continue to push rhetoric and limit freedom of expression for trans people?
So what are you asking me? Should politicians be able to make statements on what type of medical care or...
Should politicians be able to regulate what type of medical care or what type of freedom people have to express their identity?
I mean, that's not a freedom of expression. That's not a 2B issue.
So it's not. So freedom of expression, when it comes to trans rights, are excluded. Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I'm saying.
So my question to you is: should politicians be in a position to regulate the freedom of trans people or the LGBTQ2S community from expressing who they are and seeking care and treatment to be able to be who they wish to be or who they are?
Is that happening? Can you give me the example?
Yeah, there have been positions in the Conservative Party, including at their last convention, to seek to ban children from accessing gender-affirming care. Do you agree or disagree with that?
So I maintain that that is not an expression issue. That would be, depending on what you mean by gender-affirming care, there's a broad spectrum of what that could include. It could include surgery. It could include pronoun use. It could include pharmaceutical interventions. And
thank you very much, Ms.
Surgery is not a
Gein.
freedom of expression issue. There could be a Section 15 claim in
Yeah.
this.
Thank you very much.
Being litigated.
Yeah, we're at the 4-minute plus. Thank you, Mr. Noor Mohammed. Thank you to the guests, Ms. Van Geyn. Thank you, Mr. G. Along with Ms. Baraban. Thank you for coming today, and Mr. Rainville. I want to thank each and every one of you. Is the committee in agreement then that we'll adjourn this meeting? Thank you.